All right, welcome to our first case study of the year, the Yakama tribal or confederated tribes. And so our learning targets as we're going through this particular lesson are just going to be that you know how the Stevens Treaties impacted one of the largest groups of tribes in Washington state. And what success is going to look like is just that you can apply what you have learned to begin researching and thinking through Native American experiences in the 1800s and beyond, with the ultimate goal of integrating those experiences into your mural panel. All right, so we're going to start with just looking at a video that's going to show us how land ownership and control has shifted across time. Right, and it's going to do the whole U.S. And then we'll narrow in, we'll look at Washington State a little bit closer here in a minute. But as you're watching this video, and it is a short video, things that I want you to think about and jot yourself some notes about. So if you don't have pencil and paper, now is a good time to pause the video and grab those. Okay, so those questions, the blue areas on the map are traditional native lands. The red ones are reservations. What do you notice about the changes in those two colors as we're watching the video? Okay. And then think for a moment about why do you think that might be? What do you know about what's going on? And we'll talk about these questions after we watch the video, but I do want you just to jot yourself some ideas and check and see if you're right when we do this. All right. So as we were watching that, right, those blue areas, we started in 1783, so that's not before contact, but after by almost 100 years. Okay, maybe a little bit more. But those blue areas on the map were traditionally native areas. Okay, so I'm going to back my video up just a little bit so we can look at the very beginning of that. And as we go across time, right, so this is 1783. And as we go across time, you'll see those areas, those blue areas shrink, and those, I guess they're orange, not red. Sorry, they're red on the map I'm going to show you, become mostly smaller, and then there's a point where the Oklahoma where it becomes larger, right? Until we end in 2010 with that's the remaining land that is Native American areas. So what did you notice as you were watching it? Right? Hopefully what you pulled out was something about how the volume of land, right, the amount, increased dramatically across time. Okay? It decreased dramatically across time. And for the most part, those decreases are not regained. Okay, so it's not like we're looking at warring countries that are fighting each other and the borders are moving around as they're fighting each other, but by and large, Native American groups are giving up land and whites are taking over that land. So why do you think that might be? And what do you know about what's going on? Think about some of the learning we've been doing the last few weeks, maybe some things you've picked up in other places, perhaps other classes, or just from the air, right? Why do you think that might be? Okay. So if you know anything about this history, then you might have heard of the idea of manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is this idea that the U.S. should stretch from coast to coast. Right, so we start out here on the East Coast, but the idea is we should go all the way over to the West Coast, and that should be dominated by the USA, and especially because the USA at the time and still politically is dominated by white Americans, that should be territory that is dedicated to American citizens. Okay, and you can watch that westward expansion as you can see, as we're watching the video, and you can see those territories, those blue areas getting closer and closer to the West Coast, right? Closer and closer to California over here, until ultimately most of that territory has been transferred, right? It is gradual in the sense that it takes about 100 years to happen, which in historical time is not very much, but for you and me feels like a fairly long time. Okay? That's if you know something about the history. If you don't, you might have pulled something maybe about Indian wars. If you like to watch old westerns or things like that, right? You might have pulled something like that. When I was a kid, we used to play Cowboys and Indians, which is very much about reenacting that conquest of the American West, right? Things like that. So the specific group we're going to look at are the Yakama Confederated Nations. So this is that same map, but now we're looking at Washington State. Okay, and you know it's Washington. Here's the border down here. That's the Columbia River. Goes up to, I forget where it cuts north, but it cuts north somewhere. Right about there, I think. Maybe it's up there. But this is the border, right? That's Oregon down there. That's Idaho right there. And we've got the straight line right there. That's Canada north of there, right? So it's Washington State. We're going to be talking about the Yakama Confederated Tribes, which is this little red area in the middle here. Okay. There are many other reservations here in Washington that you will be picking from and choosing from potentially to study, right? So this, for example, is the Spokane Reservation over here. That one is probably the Muckleshoot right there. That one's Puyallup, I'd imagine. Okay, lots and lots of ones that you can pick from to study, but we're going to be talking about the Yakama today. All right, so we've talked about land being lost. We've looked at what's the specific area we're going to talk about. But before we can do anything else, all right, what we need to do is talk a little bit about the Stevens Treaties. And Isaac Stevens is first territorial governor of Washington State. And he comes out to Washington, and as he's going to get here, he's negotiating treaties along the way. Okay, so we call this the Treaty Trail. And in Washington, there's 4 big meetings with groups of people. And he manages to convince folks to hand over control of a lot of the land. So we've got the 4 different treaty groups, right? 4 different treaties here on the screen. And sorry, it looks like there's 8 actually. I lied. But as you can see, oftentimes when we're talking about these, there's lots and lots of groups are meeting together because we're talking about potentially smaller groups. And so rather than doing 6 kabillion small meetings, he's doing several much larger meetings. Right? And I think the big exception are the Macaw and the Nez Perce. And everywhere else there's various groups. But each one of these treaties have some things in common. Okay? And these are fairly common for treaties all across the U.S., but they're specifically common when we're talking about Washington State. Okay? So part of what he wants to do, he wants to free up as much land as possible. And he wants to make sure that there's not a bunch of little bitty spots where they can't go. So he's going to concentrate tribes together where possible and practical. Okay. So practical, remember, just means that it's not too hard to do. Agriculture and other civilized, we're going to put civilized in quotation marks, habits were to be encouraged. Okay, civilized is kind of a loaded term, and in this case, we're going to read it to mean white or European habits were to be encouraged. And I want you to stick a pin in that because we're going to come back to it in a little bit. Okay. Native lands are purchased with annuities, payments of goods that occur across time rather than cash. So annuities, big thing you got to know is it's payments across time. Okay. And in the case of these specific annuities, they're goods, not cash. So it's things like blankets or seed, things like that. Okay. The government is expected to provide teachers, doctors, farmers, blacksmiths, and carpenters to care for and train Native Americans. So again, back to that idea of civilized habits being encouraged in agriculture. They're going to provide some ways to do that with the blacksmiths and the carpenters and so forth, right? They want to cut down on the warfare between groups. So the intertribal warfare is prohibited. It's a fancy schmancy way of saying they're not allowed to fight each other anymore. Okay. Slaveholding is to be abolished. Abolished means gotten rid of or forbidden. Okay. Liquor trade was to be eliminated. So we're going to stop trading alcoholic beverages to Native Americans, and we're going to, if people try to do that, we're going to forbid them from doing it, and we're going to go after them for doing it. Okay. Another key point that I want you to put a pin in and we're going to pick up later is this idea of Native Americans being allowed to hunt, fish, and gather other traditional foods until they had been fully civilized. Okay. And then eventually, the idea is that we'll get rid of the reservation lands by breaking them up into individual allotments. An allotment means we're going to break it up and everybody's going to get a piece. Okay. So we'll come back to that one too here in just a minute. Right. The really kind of the key big picture piece is this idea of civilized habits being encouraged. That's what all of this is about. And it's what all of this is about. Okay, so we've got those treaties negotiated. Isaac Stevens comes in, he's the territorial governor, right? And then what happens? We've got a lot of different things that happen across time. Okay, so first one is what's called the Donation Claim Act. And this is a federal government thing, because remember, Washington's a territory until 1898, when they grant statehood. Okay, I think it's 1898. And that means the federal government, especially early in, is making most of the decisions. So this is a federal law, and what it does is it provides applicants with up to 320 acres of free land. So remember, the 1800s, most people are farmers, and depending on when in the 1800s we're talking about, there's lots and lots of immigrants moving from Europe, and they're moving from Europe because they can't get land to farm. Okay, so they're providing up to 320 acres of free land if they move to Washington or Oregon between 1850 and 1853. Trick is, you have to live on the land, okay, and you have to farm the land. So it's not just, I put in a piece of paper and magic, I get a lot of money. It's, I have to live on the land, I have to farm on the land, okay? And you have to do it for 4 years. And then at the end of the 4 years, that's when you get the title. Okay, so that's the Donation Claim Act. The Homestead Act, which is much more famous and much better known, is the same basic idea, okay, but it's going to provide any citizen with up to 160 acres anywhere in the West, so it's not just Washington and Oregon, but anywhere in the West, if they live on the land and farm it. Okay. So again, it's not enough to put in a piece of paper and never go anywhere, right? You have to actually move out and live on the land. And it's around that time, by the way, 1850s, is when Isaac Stevens is coming over. So after we've done this for about a generation, we've fought the Indian Wars, we've got most of the land transferred, okay, and we're going to look at one of those as treaties here in a minute. What we get is what's called the Dawes Act. And so we've got these reservations that are created. We've started educating people, right? We've moved in some of the folks that we promised. We're paying the annuities and so forth and so on. Okay. And we decide, by we, I really mean the U.S. government, decides it's time to go ahead and start splitting up those reservations. And that's what the Dawes Act does. Okay, so it provides for the division of reservation lands into individual allotments. So remember, allotments mean pieces, right? Individual allotments of anywhere from 40 acres for just like an 18-year-old kid with no dependents who's not married, up to about 160 acres, which is a married person with dependents and so forth, that can then be bought or sold by the deed holder. So before this, all the land on the reservations was communal. Meant nobody could buy and sell individual pieces. Okay, if the community was going to do something with the land, the community had to make that decision. Wasn't just up to Joe Schmo. With the allotments, now all of a sudden land on the reservation can be bought and sold without community permission. Okay. After they've passed out deeds to everybody in the community, then whatever's left is just free to be sold, and it's the U.S. government that reaps those profits. Okay, it's not the tribes themselves. They don't get to make a decision about whether or not they're going to sell that land. It just gets sold. Okay. And land that's just getting sold, it's not getting sold to Native Americans, even as a top priority, but instead it's getting sold to the highest bidder. So for the most part, that leftover land with reservations that are getting broken up under the Dawes Act is sold to whites. Okay, so they end up losing something in the neighborhood of 90 million acres across the U.S. of Native American land under the Dawes Act. Right? And it gets modified a little bit over the years, and it's in place until about 1934. So there are a fair number of reservations that get gotten rid of, and a lot of land that gets disposed of under the Dawes Act, but not all of it. Okay, and once a reservation is allotted and land broken up and sold, then the reservation itself is terminated, and now folks no longer have a claim to any of that land, or even to those traditional sites for hunting and gathering and things like that, because the idea is, go back to that previous slide, that they've been civilized. Remember, we're putting that in quotation marks, with all that implies. So we're going to skip ahead about 100 years, right? Things are bad, getting worse. The Bolt decision happens in the 1970s. So let me back up just a little bit and say the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there's a lot of social movements. You're probably familiar with the civil rights movement, right? And that's the Black communities movement. You might be familiar with third wave feminism. That's the women's movement. Okay. But there are movements in pretty much every minority community in the country, including Native Americans. And part of that Native American movement is a push to enforce those treaties, and specifically to enforce the provisions that are providing for access to traditional lands and access to traditional resources. And that's where the Bolt decision comes in. Okay, so what happens is that one of the tribes ends up suing Washington State because Washington State has been chipping away at access to these lands and fisheries, and wins in federal court, and it's decided that Washington State must share access to those, that Native tribes will get 50% of the harvest, and that the lands must be managed in common. Okay. That means that the tribes in the state are equals when it comes to managing those lands. Okay. And this is where we start to see a large turnaround, especially here in Washington State, with regards to revitalizing indigenous languages and traditions, cultures, right? Everything from whale hunting by the macaw on the Olympic Peninsula to language classes, for example, that they offer at the Muckleshoot Tribal School, which is in Auburn. Or I should say it's not, I don't think it's in Auburn, it's on the reservation, it's just east of Auburn. Okay. To, for example, the development and growth of the Northwest Indian College, which is just outside of Bellingham, Washington, right? So it really kind of serves to help revitalize and re-energize those communities, and we're continuing to reap those benefits today as we're seeing the regrowth of those communities. So the last point I want to bring up, which is out of order in terms of our timeline, but arguably is in some ways one of the most influential, is this idea of residential boarding schools. And really a better term for those instead of residential boarding schools is to say assimilation schools, because the whole point is, to borrow a quote from one of the earliest headmasters of one of these schools, is that we want to kill the Indian to save the man. We want to extinguish Native American cultures. That's what this means. Okay. In order to civilize or to save, in his words, Native American peoples. Okay. So these are not nice places. Kids are, sometimes they're kidnapped and brought to schools. Sometimes they are just simply required to attend. By and large, they're boarding schools. They're not on reservations. Okay, they could be hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away from where kids are born. And they're extremely negative experiences, extremely negative experiences. I can't overstate how harmful these were for Native American communities. Okay. Kids are literally discouraged from visiting home on school breaks, if not outright forbidden. They are absolutely forbidden to speak their own languages, to maintain their own cultures in any way. So they're not allowed to hunt and fish. They're not allowed to keep their hair in traditional styles. They're not allowed to wear traditional clothing. They are forcibly assimilated. They are stripped of their culture and required and expected to take up white culture, right? So they're required to engage in activities that are going to make them more like the dominant culture. And by and large, what it comes down to is it's trade schools. So at the beginning, right, with the real little kids, it's more like your kind of your standard elementary school with abuse, right? And then as kids are getting a little older, closer in age to yourselves, right? Still younger than you, but closer in age. That's when you start to see training around everything from blacksmithing to farm work and agricultural labor to with the girls being taught how to clean house and how to do laundry and how to sew, right? Very much the opposite of those traditional ways of living. And in the process of this, right, kids are estranged from their families. They are estranged from their cultures, right? And ultimately, in both oftentimes a very literal and a metaphysical, or not a metaphysical way, but a cultural way, they are left homeless. Okay. So sometimes they go back to reservations and they may find that parents and grandparents and so forth have died, and so they literally don't have a home. Right? But they could also go back to reservations and find that culturally they don't have a home. They don't know how to act around other Native Americans who haven't been to the schools. They don't speak the language. They don't know how to traditionally fish or farm. Right? They don't know how to go out and gather resources. They don't know what roots are healthy to eat or what berries can be used to attract animals to hunt, right? So it estranges them from their cultures, which is the whole point of the schools, and that's why they're better termed assimilation schools than residential schools. Okay? And to do that, right, to estrange these kids and make them so that they're not native enough for native communities and they don't look white enough for white communities. So we're really, when I say we're leaving them homeless, that's really what's going on in terms of culture, right? Physical and mental abuse was the norm. Every single kid experienced some level of physical or mental abuse or both. But there are also many, many cases of sexual abuse, right? These are really, really incredibly harsh programs, and they led to issues at the time in Native American communities, and recovering from these experiences, because they go all the way up until here in the States, actually, they go a little longer than the 1920s, I think. But there are still elders in these communities that are affected by having either been in these schools or having had their parents or grandparents in these schools. So this is intergenerational trauma that these schools lead to. Okay. On that happy note, let's take a minute. Let's jot some notes, because you're going to need to answer these questions in an assignment. So I want you to pause the video here, answer these 2 questions. Right? What do you think was the greatest impact of these decisions? And I'll move the slide back here in a minute. On the ways of life of the tribes in Washington. And how do you think these decisions impacted their identities, cultures, and traditions? So again, pause the video. Okay, here's the decisions that we're talking about. And then once you're ready, go ahead, come back, and we'll pick it up with the next little bit. So pause the video. All right, so we've talked a little bit. We've been jumping around a little bit, and I promise we'll get to a timeline to help you put things in order here in a minute. Okay, but we've been jumping around a little bit. This next slide is about the Yakama Treaty. So remember I said we're going to use the Yakama as our case study. So all of those things that we were talking about there, all affecting the Yakama, but not exclusively. Okay. This treaty right here, this is the literal treaty that Stevens negotiates. Okay, so that first paragraph where it says Articles of Agreement and Convention made and concluded at the treaty ground, Camp Stevens, Walla Walla Valley, this 9th day of June in the year 1855, by and between Isaac I. Stevens, Governor and Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Territory of Washington, on the part of the United States, and the undersigned head chiefs, headmen, and delegates of the Yakama, Palouse, Piskus, Wenatchepon, Klickitat, Tlingit, Kawasai, Liaiwas, Skinpa, Wishlam, Shiks, Ochichots, Kamitpa, and Siapkat, confederated tribes and bands of Indians, occupying lands hereinafter bounded and described and lying in Washington Territory, who for the purposes of this treaty are to be considered as one nation, under the name of Yakama, with Kamayakin as its head chief, on behalf of and acting for said tribes and bands, and being duly authorized thereto by them. All right. So first of all, let me apologize if I mispronounced any of those names, if you know how to pronounce them and I got them wrong for the different tribal groups. But as I was reading this, first thing I noticed is there's like 10 or 12 groups, and we're just going to treat everybody as one, right? So we've got this long list of tribes, but we're going to call them Yakama, and we're going to call them the Yakama Confederated Tribes. And that's really what they say, right? And then we're going to appoint one person, in this case Kamayakin, as its head chief. Okay. And it doesn't say, incidentally, who appoints Kamayakin. I happen to know because he's a fairly famous chief, right? That he had widespread popular support within his community and within those various tribal groups, but that wasn't always the case. Okay, and we're not always talking about treaty negotiators who were operating in good faith with acknowledged leaders. Kamayakin is an acknowledged leader of the Yakama. Okay, so he's one of those people who is actually able to speak on behalf of the group. Okay. And then we got the beginning of the first article, and I'm going to read that, talk about that. And that one is about the cession of lands to the United States. So Article 1. The aforesaid confederated tribes and bands of Indians hereby cede, relinquish, and convey to the United States all their right, title, and interest in and to the lands and country occupied and claimed by them, and bounded and described as follows, to wit, and then the rest of the paragraph is a description of basically central Washington. Okay, so big piece you got to pull out of here, right? The tribes are losing land. When it says cede, relinquish, and convey, cede is to give away, relinquish is to release control of, and convey means to hand over. So Yakama Confederated Tribes are giving up all of this land that's being described in the rest of the paragraph. Okay. And that's really the most important key piece of this, in terms of that's what's going on with this treaty, right? It goes on later on to say what he's going to give them, but we covered the basics of that with the slide about the Stevens treaties. Okay. So here's our timeline. Remember, I promised you a timeline. Okay. So the Yakama Treaty signed 1855. That's right here on my top left. And as soon as that treaty is signed, Stevens opens up land to settlers. So immediately we start seeing what was already kind of going on, but in a less formal way, but now it's a legal way, right? He starts opening up tribal land to settlers. Thing is, there's no provision for protecting the reservation and no time to really make sure that everybody's aware. And so as a result, as you see white people surging in and trying to assert control, unsurprisingly, you see the Yakama Confederated tribal members, especially ones who weren't there for the negotiations, begin to push back. And there's conflict, and that's the Yakama Wars. Okay. So these go on for a few years, and the wars conclude in 1858. Okay. Tribe is pushed on to a reservation, and then they're penalized by having the treaty broken, and half of the land that was originally promised is given away. Okay, so now not only do they not have enough time to really get moved on to the reservation and to make sure everybody was aware of what was going on, right, and the specifics, but now they're forced onto the reservation, and they're forced onto even less land. Okay, so that's the 1850s. Okay, so now that we've got everybody forced onto the reservation, then we jump into the 1860s, and now we start to see the setup of government schools. Okay. Remember, it's a large reservation, so think back to that map we looked at towards the beginning of this thing half an hour ago. And remember, it's a large reservation, so for some of those kids, it's going to be a residential school. For others, they might be living nearby it. Okay, but the school's set up on the reservation to begin with. Okay. Typically, those are managed by faith organizations. So it's not like it's the U.S. government, or it's not like it's the Yakama tribe controlling the school. It's not even like your school where it's the local government that's controlling it. Okay, it's very much the federal government, and they're delegating authority to these religious organizations. Okay, so 27 years later, the Dawes Act is signed, and we begin to see reservations being split up around the country, slowly but surely, right? That happens. It's not all at once, and it's not every reservation, and that is worth knowing. That's why we still have reservations. Okay. But nonetheless, it has an impact. And by 1933, which is around the time the Dawes Act is revoked in, I think, 1934, okay, we start to see the Yakama tribe, remember that's what we were calling them in the treaty, they get organized into, and now we recognize that there's more than one group there, right? And they become the Confederated Tribes of the Yakama Nation. So we're recognizing that there is more than one group in there that we need to be concerned with. And then in about 1994, so remember the Bolt decision is in the 1970s, and we begin to see that resurgence and revitalization of Native cultures. By 1994, then we see a change in the spelling from Yakama with an I to the more traditional Yakama with an A. And that's how it's spelled even till today when we're talking about the tribes. Okay, so if you're talking about the city of Yakama, that's with an I. If you're talking about the tribes, that's with an A. All right. Stay with me. We're getting there. Okay. One more video to really kind of drive some of this home. And again, as you're going through, this is another spot where I want you to make sure you're taking some notes if you haven't been as we go. Okay. We're going to see an interview with a Yakama elder named Marlene Silma. And she's going to talk about the perspective on the treaties and their impact on her people. And if we were in class at about 4:45, we'd stop and have a discussion of that. Okay, so know that that's going to be basically done by that point. And then they're going to move into and shift gears into a discussion of murals and community murals. And we're going to see what she thinks about this idea of community murals. And that's going to be done about 7:05 in terms of the timing. All right, without further ado.
I am Marlene Spencer Simla. I don't know where the name came from, but my great-great-great-grandfather was born probably in the 1800s, and his name was Spencer. His son also was Chief Spencer, and they were chiefs of their own little villages. And they told them when it was time to go out and gather the roots, when it was time to go hunting, when it was fishing, and when they were done fishing. And they didn't go out and catch like 20 fish and sell them. They traded with the neighbors, or they shared. It's nothing like today, commercial. They only used what they needed. The Yakamas aren't a tribe. The Yakama, now they are, but Yakama starts from way up above Wenatchee, up in the mountains, and comes all the way down to below the Columbia River, and it's comprised of all these different villages, all different kinds of Native American names. And usually means like that's a hill, that's a river, that's a stream, that's where the names, how they name them. They couldn't pronounce all those names. Klickitat, Chinook, Cowlitz, so they just said, you're Yakama, because of the Yakama River. The United States was only first 14 states back east, and then as the settlers came coming this way to the Mississippi River, then it became 30 states, and then down toward California, they were fighting the Mexican War. They were all kinds of war. The Spanish-American War. The Indians were fighting them to get out. They just kept coming. The settlers, of course, had the power with the guns. There are just way too many settlers. The treaty said, you sign this. The army told the chiefs, you come here and sign this paper. We're going to educate your kids. They're going to learn, it's like we were pagans, we were savages. And they said, no, you have to learn society. You have to learn to be civil. If they didn't, they were hung. They strung them up to a tree and hung them. The white man hanged people. Indian kids were removed from their families. No more grandma, no more mom, dad, uncle. They were put with military, where they had to march every day. March in a straight line. And respect the flag. About 1872 or 1874, somewhere in there, this guy named Dawes, D-A-W-E-S, did this act with Congress. He said, all of these Indians wandering around the reservation, we're going to give them land. We're going to teach them to farm that land. They're going to raise their own cucumbers and their own tomato and their own corn. They're going to start being civilized. Stop this running around and picking berries and picking roots and So they called it the Allotment Act. We're giving you 80 acres, you 80 acres, your wife 80 acres, your 4 kids 80 acres each. You're all going to use this land and learn to live on it and stop this wandering around. You're going to school. We're going to build you a hospital for when your people get sick. We're going to build you a big school and educate your kids. We're going to do this for you, whether they liked it or not. And so that's how they got the land, the Allotment Act. The Indians found out some of them liked to drink. They could sell their allotment for 2 bottles of beer and $100. And they were selling their allotment and moving back in with mom. That was their custom. And they said, at first it was happening so fast, they said, wait a minute, what are you guys doing? You don't be selling your land. So the settlers loved it. They came flying in. They said, here, I'll give you a case of beer. And here's $50, and I'll take your land. But you can come back and visit me. And they did, yeah. And so the white man said, we're going to build a town here and name it after me, Smith. This is Smithville. You know, and they did. They got the allotment, they cut it up into 205 acres each, and let the white man build. Murals are history. I'm only speaking for myself, not for the tribe. I didn't care for the murals when they first began. I said I'd help them paint, and they looked at me like, who are you? They didn't know who I was. It was white people painting Indians. There's one mural where it shows them all drumming. They're playing a stick game and drumming. All the Indians look alike. We don't all look alike. We're each unique. Depending, a lot of white people, how they did good for us. They're not painting the Indian's perspective. People need to understand each other in order to respect each other. And they can come here. They bring schools here. There are groups that come here. And they see how we used to live. Yeah. And they respect. You respect this culture by understanding it.
All right. So take a minute if you didn't pause the video while you were watching. Okay. And think about answer those questions in your notes, right? What is Marlene Silma's perspective on the treaties and their impacts on her people? Okay, so remember she talked about how the reservation was created. She talked a little bit about the schools. She talked a little bit about the allotment and how that worked out, right? And what that meant. And then question number 2, what does she think of the murals that she sees? Okay, so they're showing some murals in the Toppenish area. What does she think of those murals? Go ahead, pause the video, jot yourself some notes to those 2 questions or some more notes, and then we've got one more slide and we'll go ahead and wrap up. Okay, so last part. Promise I'm going to wrap this up quick. We're going to begin doing our actual research with the stories of the local tribes. Okay, so you're going to pick a tribe in the area where you live. So I want you to pick a group that is located near where you live. Okay, and you're going to research their story. And as you do, this is going to stay consistent. We're going to be researching for the next week or so. Okay, so you're going to be doing the same tribe the whole time. and you're going to feature their story on your part of the mural. So as you're doing your research, I want you to think about what's some information that I could portray as part of our mural. Okay. We've got 4 questions right there that we're going to be researching over this week and next. For right now, for this week, you really only need to pick 1 or 2, and then the rest you'll pick up next week and research. Okay. So here are our 4 questions. What decisions impacted the tribes in the region where you live, and how? Okay. So that second part is key. Not just identifying what decisions impacted, but how did those decisions make a difference? Okay. How have those decisions impacted tribes' relationships to the land, both historically and today? Okay, so look at what changes got made in the 1800s, sure, maybe throughout the 1900s, but also a little bit about how they interact with the land today. Okay. Did the tribes in your region resist? And if so, how? And resistance could be everything from warfare, right? That's a very violent method of resistance. But it could be as simple as insisting on teaching their way of life to their children. Right? That's not a violent way to resist, but it is absolutely a form of resistance. Could be telling those traditional stories. It's another similar kind of nonviolent form of resistance. So absolutely look at some of the more violent, more vocal ones, protest movements, wars, and things like that. But look at some of the nonviolent ones that allow tribal cultures to continue across time as well. Okay. And then that last question, how have the tribes or tribal members stayed connected to one another historically and today? So how are they maintaining that sense of community, both historically and today? Again, pick 1, maybe 2 of those questions to start researching this week, and you're going to turn them into assignment 2.1.3. It's a yes/no assignment. You're going to turn in notes that address 1 or more questions. You're going to get full credit. End of discussion. Okay. The rest of the questions, and if you want some additional research on that first question or 2, will get turned in next week so that I can kind of see how you're doing and see what you're learning. And then next week, we'll also have an opportunity for you to share some of that learning with your classmates and your colleagues. As with anything, if you have questions or if you need help with things, please, please, please feel free to let me know. Reach out and I'll do whatever I can for you. In terms of your research, I want you to start with the tribal websites. Okay, so if you're going to research the Muckleshoot, look at the Muckleshoot tribal website. If you're going to research the Puyallup, start with the Puyallup tribal website. If you're going to research the Nooksack, those folks live up north, right? Start with the Nooksack tribal website. You can expand outward from there, but start with the tribal website. All right, go ahead and go. I'll see you in class.